Before we get into the introducing this, I just wanted to mention I was considering adding some background music to this video. Um, so for one thing, I was thinking at some points I might want to play musical examples out of these pieces, but I actually don't think I'm going to do that. I don't think these would really benefit from a discussion bookended by examples. Really, I think that just explaining it, I think that just talking through it is going to be just better for the purposes of this. Uh, and I was so then after that, I was also considering playing probably some of this music as background music, and I think I'm deciding against that because um, well, for one thing, it prevents me from having to interact with the YouTube copyright detection system, which I don't think I would. I think I wouldn't have serious problems with that, but it's nice to just sidestep it entirely. But I wanted to encourage you to um, consider throwing some of this on as background music to this video, just of your choosing. Um, there's no way I could pick just one, and so what is this I hear you say? This is well, we're here on tiermaker.com, um, and uh, I'm going to briefly discuss every piece of music by the composer Steve Reich, um, eh, with the goal of sorting them into tiers, as it were. Um, and we'll see how that goes. I haven't really thought very clearly about what my grading criteria are going to be, so those might have to evolve. I might have to add some tiers, and things are generally just going to have to be very. Um, I'm going to have to make a lot of tough calls to assess this in a way that will be interesting. You know, really, there should be no D tier. It should start at C or B and then go up to like quadruple S probably. But I don't know. We'll maybe futz around with that a little bit as we get on. So, um, uh, before we dive into that, I guess I should mention that uh, just sort of why I'm doing this or why I think this will be interesting. And the short answer to that is that I just feel very familiar with most of these pieces. There's a few on here that I have to confess a much lesser or a greatly reduced actually familiarity with, namely the two or three of the four or five most recent works in his catalog. Um, they're more recent, they're from recent years. Uh, Recordings haven't been available for some of that time, although they kind of are now. Um, and I've just, some of those I've only heard two or three times. I'm afraid, but the rest of these I've heard dozens and dozens and dozens of times. Most of them. Um, I became a big fan back in probably about 2000. I think it was 2012 that I was I finally sort of stumbled across his music at a time when I was not really actively seeking much new, interesting music. I just happened to come across a recording, probably pretty widely viewed recording of music for 18 musicians. I want to say it was uh, 2008, Tokyo, Japan. I might have the year wrong, but that's the performance. It's a lovely video. The videography of that performance is also very nice. Um, I mean, like the visual dimension of that piece is definitely uh, very significant to its overall like effect. Um, and this was 2012. I was like not. I was sort of writing a little bit less music at that time because I had just sort of started learning theory, and a lot of my really really early music, um, I was just like, things have got to change. I can't, I don't know. My awareness had increased a little bit, and I was also playing instruments in school, um, at the time, and just I'd been like exposed to just enough different rep at that time that I was beginning to kind of ferment as a composer, and this is discovering this music is really what catalyzed that for me. I mean, after that, I went to college to study music composition, and for the first 2 or 3 or 4 years of that study, um, this loomed larger than pretty much anything. This collection of works, in just the way that I became familiar with various things. So I don't know. This means a lot to me, and I'm extremely familiar with a lot of this music. I've studied many of these pieces very closely. Some of them not so much, but and the most recent ones I've only heard a few times. But so I don't know. That's my that's my angle here. That's my sort of qualification to be talking about this. Um, Oh yeah, the other thing I wanted to say about you know discovering this music in 2012 was that I had just recently, like I think a year before that, started playing mallet percussion, which is now like my kind of my primary instrument, and I sometimes compose for it, uh, although kind of not as often as I want to. But like most of these pieces have like like the marimba and vibraphone, and really especially the vibraphone, feature in like more of these pieces than not. I think it's probably actually over half. So very interesting stuff. Um, I so let's get into sorting this out. Um, I'm tempted to do one of two things. I have his work list open on his webpage over here, and I was thinking of maybe going in chronological order, but the other approach I could take would be to look for kind of wedges to where I can say, well, this piece is definitely one tier above this piece, right? And then I can insert those in and kind of build this list out around that. Um, because I think I need to think that tactically about this because well, I don't know. I mean, the alternative is just things are going to probably shuffle around a lot after the discussion of them has really concluded, which is not ideal for this format. I love this idea of this meme, if you like to call it that, um, just because of uh, it's a platform for kind of that stimulates a little bit of criticism, which has the potential to be kind of interesting, but it's also it's I don't know, it's a good amount of pressure, just sort things into a grading system, right? um it's non trivial, but at the same time pretty low pressure. um so I don't know, I think it's nice. So let's I guess we'll just go chronologically. um so that means we start with It's Gonna Rain, which is uh you know, it almost feels like in the years shortly after this, and when he, well, so I mean, the thing is that the purely electronic works or the tape works. Well, yeah, no, that's sort of two categories, but those all come from the earliest, years of his catalog, and uh, to me, they kind of represent his closest contact with, just like the entire American avant-garde art scene. These pieces, where, let me find it. It's gonna rain in this list here. Oh, how difficult is that gonna be? Here it is. Um, am I Let me make sure I'm capturing my cursor. Hold the phone. Wait just a damn second. Oh Lord, this the setting about whether to capture the mouse cursor in OBS could literally be anywhere. I should probably just Google it. Hang on a second. So for me, uh, this is a work that is like best understood in that context of 60s avant-garde art, and it changes the way I really look at it. And I also think that his works in the years immediately following this represent kind of a break with that. As he, for 10 or 15 years, or really longer than that, I mean, he continued to do that while writing these other works in the 80s. He switched to concentrating on touring, on you know putting together ensembles and touring with them, and playing with other musicians. And so that, he has that kind of, I mean, yeah, there was for the longest time there was Steve Reich and musicians, and that um those concert works from mostly the 70s, are the ones I'm thinking of. Although, like I said, it continues throughout the 80s and I believe the 90s, and I think maybe even into the aughts. Um, uh, to me, that kind of represents a break with the, more, I don't know, the kind of, yeah, whatever this idea is that I'm associating with it. It's gonna rain. Okay, I should be capturing my cursor, but I don't see it in the video preview, but it says it's being captured. So I I don't know why I shouldn't believe it, but I don't. But it's fine. It's not super important. So, um, it's gonna rain. Um, let's see here. It is fantastic to listen to, but I believe I'll probably have to express some bias towards the instrumental music just because of that being kind of my own taste. Like, not that any of this is necessarily easy listening, so to speak, but it's gonna rain is almost definitely not anybody's idea of an easy listen, right? I mean, it's intense and, uh, you know, um, but I'm gonna stick it in B tier for right now. Um, and just we'll see. Highly subject to change B tier. And so immediately following It's Gonna Rain, we have another tape piece come out, which I can find in this list if I'm very good at reading, which I'm not. Come out. I'm gonna put a tier below It's Going to Rain because it's which I just botched the pronunciation of for some reason. Come Out is processually a lot more straightforward than It's Gonna Rain. I want to say that like the second part of It's Gonna Rain has basically the same process as Come Out, where he phases something to 180 degrees and then resamples that and then phases that to 180 degrees, which is 90 degrees relative to the original. And I think that that's the structure of part 2 of It's Gonna Rain, although I could be mistaken about that. And that's definitely the structure of Come Out. And you know, Come Out is such a short loop as well, that it for me has like a little less sort of timbral intrigue and a more just prevalent hypnotic quality compared to It's Gonna Rain. And also there's nothing in Come Out quite like there is in the first part of It's Gonna Rain, where the actual scanning of the loop goes through a phase cycle. That I didn't realize that that's what was happening until like really very recently, like within like the last couple of years, because I just, you know, these pieces I listen to somewhat less often than a lot of the other ones. I'm somewhat less familiar. But like, yeah, so there's this formal idea in It's Gonna Rain, or a processual idea that I don't actually think has any equivalents in any of the later works. So I mean, that's really interesting. So for me, I'm putting Come Out a tier below It's Gonna Rain. I don't know. I'm sorry if you really love Come Out. It's a nice piece, but for me, It's Gonna Rain is just a little more interesting. So next we have the instrumental phase pieces. Violin phase and piano phase. And I think I'd prefer to just discuss both of those pieces in one breath and say that formally they're quite similar, but the orchestration is somewhat different. Violin phase is for 4 violins, and I believe the way that works is that 2 of the violins are constantly engaged in the phase process, and then the other 2 wait, actually, I really don't know. Actually, I'm not that familiar with the structure of violin phase. I've heard it a good number of times, but I've never looked at the score, and I've only seen 1 or 2 video performances. But so formally, I mean, there's a big difference in that the violin phase is for 4 instruments and piano phase is for 2 pianos. The form of piano phase is just this loop phases, goes through a complete phase cycle with itself. I'm going to go ahead and put piano phase in C tier. Whereas in violin phase, you have this complexity of violins contributing, and again, I don't know whether, I don't remember whether it's because there's 4 violins, and I feel like it would only take 1 to really contribute new patterns, but that's what happens. There winds up being new patterns which are picked out from the resulting combination of the phase process. Whether that phase process is in 2 parts or 3 parts, it could be that 3 of the players, or even maybe sometimes all 4 of them, contribute to the complexity of the phase canon. But I just don't remember off the top of my head. But to me, that makes it really, really interesting. I think that that's a really cool additional sort of process layer. And the other thing is, I think that so I mean, part of it is just that okay, let me get my thoughts out in the correct order here. So I'm gonna put violin phase at here above, and then I'll consider whether I'm actually comfortable with this being a square, or whether maybe I need to move these up, or the tape pieces down. I don't want to move the tape pieces down, but maybe I should. And like I said at the start, this shouldn't be DCBAS. This should be, BCA double S quadruple S, etc., etc. But but I don't even know about that. I think this is actually better. I think that is about how I feel about these pieces. So anyway, getting back to the topic of these 2 works. Piano phase, the melodies. Is there more than one melody in piano phase? I don't even know off the top of my head. Good gosh. I don't remember. I really don't remember. I think either all of piano phase is this one pattern, this one like 12-note pattern, or it starts as a 12-note pattern, and then there's a new pattern that's like a shorter version of that, and then maybe another pattern that's like an even shorter version of that. I don't actually remember. But anyway, going off of the first pattern, the thing is that all of the patterns, if there is more than one, in piano phase, there's no rhythm to them. It's just a continuous stream of notes, and it has this internal rhythm, which is generated by the kind of the symmetries of the notes in the melody. And I guess to explain specifically what I mean by that, there's a kind of sticking to it, which in where the left and right hands are kind of disposed right on top of each other, and what you get is like a 2-note pattern in the right hand and a 3-note pattern in the left hand, right? Because it goes da na 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 na. So I mean, like, in that sense, there are rhythmic properties that emerge out of that underlying pattern within the sequence of notes, but like, it still is just like a continuous stream of 16th notes or whatever. And so, I mean, like, because of the internal rhythm it has, interesting stuff does come out of that. However, I think even more interesting is the violin phase pattern, which actually has a rhythm, so to speak, and the rhythm it has is actually a really interesting rhythm, and it is such a good pattern that he basically wrote a giant violin phase quotation into the middle of Music for 18, where it's played in a I want to say it's a 4-part canon. It may just be a 3-part canon, where maybe one of the pianos is tacit or playing maracas, or I don't know. I don't know how Music for 18 works on that detailed of a level. Um, anyway, there's this big quotation of the pattern from Violin Phase in Music for 18. And it's great because it's a great pattern. It's really interesting. It kind of divides the 12 beats into 7 and 5. So I mean, it has this like great internal repetitiousness to it while still having this rhythmic asymmetry that makes it play really interestingly with itself in canon. So I don't know. Violin Phase is a really, really interesting piece. And I wish I remembered more precisely how both of those go, and I just don't. So maybe this is maybe this is a little more ambitious, and I should have really listened to these all again before making this. But who cares? So the next work he lists on his website is My Name Is, which is a piece for like a variable ensemble of like potentially I've heard it realized with like horns and strings, like a small brass band, or synthesizers. And it's created using samples taken from members of the audience. So there's a few like canonical recordings of it out there, but I think that the way that he actually sort of did it on tour in the late 60s and early 70s was by basically composing the tape component of the piece like backstage during the concert and then playing it at the end. So I like as a concert work, it's actually like, you know, really nifty. But I'm putting it in D tier because I just don't care about it that much. If you listen to it, you'll know what I mean. It's you know it's a really sweet idea, but I mean, you know, it compared to It's Gonna Rain and Come Out, right? The material is just it just doesn't have that level of material intrigue. Um, Another we're in 1968 now, by the way, according to his website. Another kind of this is a really kind of bizarre one, pendulum music. This I guess, you know, falls into the category of like electronic music concrete, which is just, you know, interesting. I mean, there I don't think there really is another work in his output that is quite as hard to categorize as pendulum music is, because what pendulum music is you take 4 microphones, suspend them from the ceiling, and hang them up over a loudspeaker that produces a feedback from the motion of the or from the change in what the microphone is picking up, which feeds back into, you know, which feedback gets louder and louder as the microphones continue to swing over the speakers, and as they swing, as their swing comes to cover less and less distance, the noise produced in the feedback goes from having kind of this clock-like, you know, ticking rhythm to it, to being these just continuous sounds, right? That eventually gets to the point where the microphones are picking up feedback constantly, right? So the rhythmic element, you know, it goes from having a rhythm to being continuous sounds, and it's very cool. Uh, yeah, I don't know. I would love to see a live performance of this. Um, However, I think I'm gonna put it in C tier. It's interesting, but um, so okay, now we have four organs and phase patterns, and similar to violin phase and piano phase, um, I think the best thing for me to do would be to discuss these both in one breath, and um, I'm gonna place them in these tiers tentatively, because I think my opinion is that, well, okay, so phase patterns is it has the same quality of piano phase, where it has no rhythmic variety. It's just a continuous stream of 16th notes or 8th notes. And to me, that really, really dramatically reduces like the possibilities that you can get from disposing them in a unison canon. Um, Processually, I think it's very similar to violin phase, where it's basically some. I think these two pieces are for the same ensemble. It's for four electric organs, although four organs actually requires a fifth person to play the maracas. Um, but so I think that it's formally it's quite similar to violin phase, where you have two people. I think it's two people, but I don't. Like I said, I like with violin phase, I don't really know the details because I haven't studied the score. Um, you have two people doing this phase unison canon, and other people picking out melodic uh, material from the resulting combinations. Um, I just don't think it's that interesting in phase patterns. The harmonic material is a little bit more simple than it's very comparable to the material of violin phase and piano phase, but it's a little simpler uh, in a like some sort of key ways. Um, uh, and if you know the exact notes of these pieces, I think you'll see what I mean when I say that. Um, I don't know. Phase patterns for me is easy D tier, and if I add a lower tier, I might actually drop it down to that. Uh, just yeah, I don't know. Maybe I need to listen to it again. It has been a long time. But then there's four organs, and four organs is actually really good. I think it is definitely like, well, I mean, so there's the vaguely apocryphal story of it causing a small riot at I believe Carnegie Hall. Um, I say vaguely apocryphal. It's definitely a true story, right? But like, it's just difficult to when something like that happens. It's difficult to really capture um, uh, uh, the exact scope of it. Although I think probably one of the best characterizations of it that I've heard, and this comes, I've heard this repeated both, I believe, by Steve Reich himself and also by Michael Tilson Thomas, um, is that the audience became so loud that the musicians had to uh, verbally count to stay in sync. They had to like shout counts, which is the same that same metric uh, figures into the story of the riot at the premiere of the Rite of Spring, right? So very very uh, historical piece of kind of I don't know, yeah. It, it meets that criteria for historicity, if that's your criteria. Um, It's just a really lovely little piece. It's an 11, so I mean it has this asymmetry built into it, and it's just this continuous augmentation process, which at the beginning of the piece, um, augmentation process, I should specify, where across all four of the players who I believe are playing the same chord, right? So I mean, it's a I don't know 15 or 20 minute piece, and there's one harmony throughout the entire thing. It's a really nice harmony, and actually, this is a perfect time for me to go on a little tangent after this. If you know, you know. We'll get into the if you know, you know stuff. The harmony in four organs is this really nice chord. I think you best describe it as a dominant 11th chord, and the tonal significance of that is that, you know, there's this tonal tendency for dominant 7th chords to be 5/7 chords that resolve to a 1 chord. But if you add the 11th, that is the 1 chord root note. That you're taking a dominant 7th, like a 5/7 chord, and adding the root of the scale, the tonic of the scale, to it, which really, really interferes with that chord's ability to have the resolution tendency that it usually has. And so, like, in a lot of contexts, you don't see that extension. Sometimes you see it with the leading tone omitted, which gives the chord more of a suspended sound, and just makes it generally, you know, by you know, you kind of you get that same sort of flavor for the most part without really problematizing it by removing that leading tone. But removing the leading tone also really kind of is a pretty deadly blow to its identification as a dominant chord. Not the most deadly blow. I mean, if in a context where it's a tonal chord progression, it will still absolutely read as a dominant chord. Although you would probably write it as a slash chord if you didn't have the leading tone in there. But for it to be a dominant 11th chord, you know, it has both that leading tone, you know, it has both T and Do in it. And that's just a really interesting kind of little paradox, and we'll see that this is like a favorite harmony, just used to absolutely stellar effect in various pieces. Oh yeah, I guess one more thing I can say to sort of close the loop on my characterization of the dominant 11th chord is that you know, classically the fourth, despite being, you know, a perfect interval in that there's no major and minor fourth, there's just a one, and it, you know, arises from the first two notes in the overtone series. Despite being a quote unquote perfect interval, it was considered a contrapuntal dissonance. You know, only the fifth was considered like a consonance that would be appropriate to cadence to in the era in which you know, tertian harmony really developed, and the era leading up to that, right? The fourth was considered a dissonance, and in the dominant 11th chord you have the fourth between 5 and 1. The scale degree is 5 and 1. And it kind of puts that mystery of the perfect fourth into one really fleshed out harmony that has both a lot of notes in it and a very distinct diatonic tonal context, the dominant 11th chord. The fourth is between its root and its 11th is kind of its most defining interval, and the classical like sort of contrapuntal dissonance that the fourth is considered is probably the best way of looking at the kind of mysterious force going on within that chord. Okay, so I promise I won't talk about harmony much more. Um, so that's the chord in four organs, and it goes through an augmentation. And I want to say that all four players have the exact same chord voicing, so they're not contributing to the harmony in a varied way, right? They're just contributing to the volume of the chord, right? Because the augmentation process applies to the players in a kind of cycle. Um, and I don't know the details of that because I haven't studied the score, but I think that's what's happening. And from an orchestration standpoint, it's a little mysterious that there are that many players all playing this same chord. But what happens is every single note in that chord gets a little bit longer. It gets 1/8 note longer at a time, um, which at first creates a lot of interesting rhythmic variety, but by the end it's just one big sustained sound. And so in that way it's actually very similar to pendulum music in the form. Um, but I find it very, very compelling in four organs. I suppose I find it very compelling in pendulum music too, especially because to talk about pendulum music a little more, um, it oh, it only captures my mouse cursor if I have the window focused. All right, I finally understand how to use OBS. I'm only 45 minutes into this video. In pendulum music, the swinging microphone over the loudspeaker has some interesting like physics to it that gives it a unique attack characteristic as well. And that's actually something that this piece has going for it that four organs really doesn't, because well, I don't know. I suppose you could play four organs on any type of synthesizer. I believe that the synthesizers it was originally played on didn't have very interesting attack characteristics. I don't know. Who knows? It's an interesting piece. Okay, so now we're into the 70s. And the 70s starts right off with drumming. And I think I'm going to put drumming into the same tier as I have everything else here right now. Like I said, I'm going to be biased towards the ensemble pieces just because that's what really floats my boat, I guess. Drumming takes the ideas from pieces like Violin Phase, and it turns it into a multi-movement chamber ensemble piece by taking this idea of like a varied pattern. The pattern in drumming is a drumming rudiment with a particular melodic disposition across 4 bongos, or 4 notes on a marimba, or 4 notes on a glockenspiel, as the structure of the movements goes, or the order of the movements goes, I should say. That's treated to these phase canons, and then this process of melodic sifting, as we see in pieces like Phase Patterns and Violin Phase. Drumming I don't know. The drumming ensemble is definitely really nice. And you actually, despite his kind of being a percussionist, you don't really see a whole lot of drumming in a lot of Steve Reich pieces. His tendency is to turn um, pitched percussion instruments and things like pianos into the drums, or even other instruments, and have them do drumming. Um, but there's not all that much drums in his music, really. Um, and I mean the ensemble, the just the tone of the ensemble of drumming. Um, Although I believe it was kind of refined throughout the 70s, the sort of the sound just of the ensemble overall. It's really nice in drumming. I mean, the combination of bongos, marimbas, glockenspiels, and voice and whistle. And that's the other thing. The voice and the whistle to me are um, just like a little stylistically problematic. They blend super well, right? I mean, they're a wonderful contribution to the music. Um, but for them to be like functionally so sequestered off, um, and functional fixedness is a continued quality of Reich's orchestration, and for the most part, I think that that's a really good thing. Um, but when you have somebody whose only job it is to provide these emergent melodies, um, it's just, I don't know, something about it rubs me the wrong way. I can't actually quite, and I might be overstating this, to be honest. Um, so why is drumming not A tier for me? It's just hmm. Well, it also falls into this category that the rest of all of these pieces fall into, which is that it really is based all around one single melodic cell. And actually, compared to violin phase and piano phase, it's a short melodic cell. Um, or well, I guess it's the same length, but it has fewer pitches. Um, so these, I mean, like these are the pieces, including the tape pieces. These are the pieces that are really like the hardcore minimalist pieces, and those are just um those are always going to be, I think, in the somewhat lower tier for me, um unless they have some sort of very very striking property, and I've never seen any of these in concert, and so I might just not know the sort of hidden meme dimension that these things might have. This brings us to clapping music, which obviously super famous, right? I mean, if you know two pieces by Steve Reich, probably one of them is clapping music. Um, Seeing as I have all these pieces that I really like listening to in B tier, I think I'm gonna have to put clapping music in C tier. Because it doesn't have the same listenability factor. It is really interesting to listen to. Um, but the other thing about clapping music is that the process, I think, is basically invisible. Um, you in drumming, in violin phase, in piano phase, the concept of the phase canon is surface level, immediately noticeable, especially because there's actual phasing, right? So I mean, clapping music doesn't contain phasing; it just contains metric displacement, right? So it's like just the rhythmically sound permutations, and to me, it's not obvious that that's what's going on in that piece. Um, uh, the sequence of patterns that you generate by going through that discrete phasing is itself very interesting and results intimately from the symmetries of the melodic pattern, which is a really nice melodic pattern, or the rhythmic pattern, I should say, which is a really nice rhythmic pattern. It like violin phase has this sort of internal grouping of the 12 notes of 6/4 of a 6/4 bar into 5 and 7, which is just a little asymmetry that, as you rotate it against itself, shows up in this kind of pattern of different ways. And so what you get in clapping music is there will be a permutation that has no rests considered if you consider both parts in combination. And then that will alternate. It'll alternate between there being ones that don't have any rests with ones that do have rests. And then the number of rests in the ones that do have rests also varies in this kind of very, very symmetric way. So it's a really nice sequence of patterns, but as a listener, it's not obvious that that results from a phase process unless you really pay attention to what the pattern is. So, and of course, it doesn't help that the phase step is removed. Although, I mean, I don't know. The not to say that I really want to hear these things phasing in and out. Like that's not necessarily the case. I just really think it makes it less obvious that that's what's going on, and so the large scale form of clapping music to me as a listener is usually more just like, oh cool, these are a bunch of different patterns. And doesn't have that coherency of okay, we're going to 180 degrees of phase and back. So I don't know, it has that not quite going for it in my mind, but it's still fun to listen to, so I'm putting it in C tier. Similar note, we have Music for Pieces of Wood, which is actually extremely similar to clapping music, except for 5 players rather than 2. Or well, clapping music can be played by more than 2 people, but there's 2 parts, right? Oh, I forgot to talk about Odom Watermelons. Okay, all right. We're gonna come back to Music for Pieces of Wood, but I will tentatively shove it the same place I shoved clapping music, if I can find it. There it is. Because it's basically the same piece. I meant to talk about Odom Watermelons after I talked about 4 organs, because in 4 organs I discussed the dominant 11th chord, and there is a miraculous dominant 11th chord. I say miraculous because it almost sounds like the pianist made a mistake, or didn't mean to play it, or played it as a grace note, but then when it was sampled and looped, it becomes this very overt dominant 11th chord. Oh gosh, I think I've discussed enough what I should say about the dominant 11th chord. Any further kind of characterization that I might make of it would be too speculative for my liking. What it means, right, symbolically or emotionally. I just don't want to get into that right now. However, just trust me, used to great effect. I should mention Odom Watermelons is not a work in the the catalog. It is a short. It is a soundtrack to a short film. This actually might predate It's Gonna Rain, which is what he considers Opus 1. It's the soundtrack to a short film. It's not the only short film soundtrack that he made at the time, but it's the only one that I have been able to find. There's another one called Plastic Haircut, I believe, by the same filmmaker, who I believe was Robert Nelson. Um, and I've never been able to find that film, but he also did the soundtrack to that film, apparently. Um, I think that I'm going to put this disturbingly high because it has a lot going for it. Uh, it's got canons. It's got canons with transpositional relationships to them, right? All the canons and all these other pieces are unison canons, which are great. And there's canons at the unison in Odin Watermelons as well, but there's also a canon at uh, some interval. I guess it's a canon at the fifth. Um, yeah, I don't know. This is one that you just have to hear for yourself. It's a very charming little film about racial injustice, I guess, viewed from the lens of yeah. I don't even know how to describe it. It's just fantastic. Um, Kind of obvious reasons why it not is counted in the catalog. It's very early. It's a film soundtrack, but I do think the music is really really good. um, uh, yeah. Um, I don't know what else I can say about that. It's great to listen to if you have heard some of these works and some of the works that we're going to discuss from the 70s here because of how much it prefigures that same technical language of you know, rhythmic canons, um, melodic canons, and just even a lot of aspects of the harmony. I mean, it's really quite similar to something like Music for 18 Musicians. Although actually, Music for 18 Musicians does not contain uh, any dominant 11th chords. That's a little spicier than anything you see in Music for 18. Music for 18 sticks to extended triads that don't have the problem of that dissonant fourth that dominant 11th chords do have. But when it's the only harmony in your entire piece, like it is in Four Organs or it is in Odin Watermelons, uh, it becomes a really advantageous quality, right? But it can be difficult to integrate smoothly into more varied kind of palette of harmonies, perhaps I could say. So anyway, we talked about Music for Pieces of Wood briefly. I don't think I have anything else to say about it. It does have some interesting formal qualities um, that clapping music doesn't have, but I still place it in the same tier, I think, because it being in 5 parts rather than 2, it's in 5 parts rather than 2, and yet it's not 2.5 times better as a piece. It feels like less, efficient orchestration than clapping music. Although clapping music is obviously the epitome of orchestrational efficiency. I mean, you don't even need any instruments. Um, anyway, so that brings us to Six Pianos, and once again, I'm going to consider another piece in the same breath as Six Pianos, and that piece being Six Marimbas. Um,
they're the exact same piece. Uh, I think Six Marimbas was written, or I shouldn't even say written because it, is literally the same piece as Six Pianos, except it's been transposed from D major to D flat major, which is just to adapt it to the to the marimba to make the patterns playable on the marimba. You have certain intervals are a lot easier to play on than others on a mallet instrument. Yeah, so according to this, Six Pianos is from 1973, and Six Marimbas is from 1986. So that's a pretty ginormous time span. Um, I believe the story is something to the effect of, some marimbas who he had worked with wanted an adaptation of the piece for marimbas. And that idea just came much later than the composition of the original piece, probably in no small part because a piano is an instrument that you're just much more likely to find six of existing in roughly the same location than a marimba, especially back then. Um, so, I think one phrase that I've heard used in describing six pianos is, he wanted to write something for all the pianos in a piano store. So I mean, like there's a context for having so much hardware, so much of that hardware, um, that really probably wasn't there for the marimba. However, my take is going to be that, despite both being lovely, I should say, formally they use the same device from violin phase and drumming, where uh, a lot of what's going on is, um, uh, certain players devoted to the task are sifting melodies out of the result of a unison canon from certain other players. But the big difference is that in six marimbas and six pianos, the canon is at a set distance. It's not a phase canon like it is in violin phase or piano phase, and it's not even a discrete phase canon like you have in clapping music. Um, and actually, music for pieces of wood is this way as well. It takes just a few rhythmic, phase canon, uh, uh, and in music for pieces of wood, it's uh, two copies of a rhythmic pattern, and it takes certain preferred, um, what am I trying to say here? The certain preferred canonic distances, right? Canonic rhythmic displacements. That's what I should say. Displacements. Um, so that's how six pianos and six marimbas work. Um, which to me is actually a little less interesting and a little more just kind of, mind numbingly repetitious. I think I'm going to do this. I think I'm going to put six marimbas in the B tier and six pianos in the C tier. I think it's a lot cooler on marimbas for many reasons. Although, they both have their qualities, right? Both of those instruments have their qualities that shine shine uniquely through the material. Um, but I think it's cooler on marimba. And you know what? Now that I'm actually thinking about this, I might even say that I like these two pieces less than I do these other ones. So I think it's time to make some changes to this. I haven't gotten to A tier, and I still haven't gotten to S tier. So since we have contiguous um, material here, I'm gonna go ahead and add this down here. I think it's time to add. Okay, new C tier, and we'll do what I said, what I suggested we might do, which is change this nomenclature to include a double S. Or maybe we'll call that S plus. Because I really would like to put 6 pianos right there. And if I'm doing that, I would put Come Out and Pendulum Music and Music for Pieces of Wood in that tier as well. And maybe actually I wouldn't put Come Out there. I've lost my like chronological disposition of these things at this point. I think that's right, but it doesn't matter. Actually, no, Music for Pieces of Wood is last, but it doesn't matter. I think that's how I want to do this. And none of these need to be demoted. These are all good. Okay. All right, let's continue. Okay, so now we're up to music for mallet instruments, voices, and organ. I think this is going to be my first real A tier pick. Because like this is eminently listenable. I already know that I'm going to need one more. What are we going to call this one? Also, I need to adjust these color schemes a little bit, but that's not super pressing or anything, of course. We'll make this like purple. I don't want to call this S++, but it's what I'm doing for the moment. Music for Mallet's voice. Okay, and I just narrowly avoided disaster there. My computer crashed, and miraculously, I've been able to recover the video file up to this point. So, which, I mean, honestly, I'm kind of amazed that how, not only that was possible, but how easy it was. Yeah, I don't know. I can't really quantify this because I've not done that much, recording over the years, but something like that definitely wouldn't have been possible 10 or 15 years ago. I mean, that much I can say pretty confidently. So, anyway, we're back and we're good to sally forth because the video up to this point should be okay, although I'll have to scan it for, glitches and stuff. Anyway, I was about to talk about music for mallet's voice and organ, but in setting this back up, I realized that I neglected to mention melodica, which is a piece basically in the vein of piano phase, and I think I'm actually going to put it in the same tier as piano phase. It's for a melodica, which is pretty cool. It's a great little instrument. And I think the pattern is a little more interesting than the pattern in piano phase. The same comments I made about violin phase, the fact that it has rhythmic variety gives the canons a lot of variety. And piano phase does have this interesting internal rhythm, but yeah, all that stuff I talked about before, basically, it just applies there. So it's a lovely little piece. I don't have much to say about it. Music for mallet's voice and organ, and it's also not listed in his catalog, so it is from the extended universe, so to speak. Yeah, actually, I am missing a piece. I'm just now realizing. There's yet another small piece like that. Do I want to just create that? You know what? I'm stitching video files together. I'll be right back.
Okay, just ignore the slightly different font, but I realized I forgot read phase. And I don't know exactly when read phase originates from, so I'm going to address it now in the same breath as Melodica, because it's extremely similar. It's another one of these pieces that's built entirely around a phase canon, and it's actually one of the most simplistic ones in that regard, I believe. I'm going to slap it in this same tier. In fact, I'm going to slap it in one tier lower because I don't think it's that interesting. It has the same thing going as piano phase to where there's no rhythm in it. Or you know what I mean. There's no rhythmic variation and no rhythmic variety, I should say, not variation. It is in 5/8 or 5/16, which is kind of nifty, but not really. And the melodic pattern is a bit less interesting than piano phase. I think it's a solid C tier. But now that I'm looking at everything else that's in C tier, I think I'm going to dump that down to D tier. Because I think I would rather listen to pretty much any of these than read phase. So, sorry, read phase, you're going at the bottom. Melodica doesn't belong in the same tier as clapping music, or not clapping music, Six Marimbas. Piano phase, I think, still makes that cut, though. Okay, anyway. I don't know, Melodica is a cute piece, but it's no Six Marimbas. And it's also no Six Pianos, but we could ignore that. What we can't ignore is music for pieces of wood not being directly under clapping music. Anyway, finally, we're going to talk about music for mallets, voice, and organ. Sorry, mallet instruments, voice, and organ. I just abbreviated the title a little bit for the purposes of these little images. So, what to say about this? So, this is more mixed ensemble than ever. Really, the ensemble is actually quite similar to drumming, but I don't know, slightly different. There's no drums. It's drumming without the drums, and also plus a electric organ which sings or which plays chords, these repeated chord progressions, which are treated as repeated cells more than they are. It's almost not right to call it a chord progression, but it is the gesture of a chord progression repeated over and over, along with singers who supply the upper voices of the chords, and with the organ providing doublings of that and middle voices and a bass voice. So that's a new element that we haven't really seen before. That kind of the idea of there being like a harmonic middle ground, right? In pieces like Four Organs, there is like a constant, like perpetual, never changing harmony going on. And then in many of these pieces, the harmony is defined completely by the field of the melody, like in Violin Phase, for instance. But here we have like little chord progressions that are being treated as kind of another building block in this language that's very focused on process and monolithic formal construction. So that's really nice. And that when we talk about music for 18 musicians, which is the next piece in the oeuvre, yes, it is. That'll be very relevant to that. because it does that same thing, and it does it in a couple of ways. Um, Honestly, I don't have a whole lot to say about music for Mallet's voice in organ. It's really pretty, just in a way that I can't easily describe. Uh, and Yeah, without any further ado, let's um, let's get on to Music for 18. Music for 18, obviously huge, right? Probably the Steve Reich piece that anybody needs to know. Um, and so in terms of the content, right? I already alluded to the quotation from Violin Phase it contains. It has a lot of canonic ideas, but the other really major thing in Music for 18 is the pulses. Um, the piece is bookended with these sections that are just called pulses, um, where the entire ensemble plays basically like a chorale in repeated, rapid 16th notes or eighth notes. It's eighth notes, but it's very fast eighth notes. It's, you know, um, and so similarly, in the same way that Mallet Instruments voice and organ had this novel kind of dimension of chord progression. Music for 18 musicians also has that, but it disposes it in a couple of different ways. One of them being pulsations, which can occur with metric freedom. So all of these pieces, the phase process pieces, have this liberty built into them, where you know the exact number of repeats. This goes for drumming as well. All the exact numbers of repeats are totally just up to the performers and just the circumstances of the way they perform it. Um, uh, they move on when the process is complete, basically, and how long that takes can vary. Drumming has especially huge ranges of the kind of predicted numbers of repetitions that a certain uh, section might take. So performances can vary a lot. I mean, probably by, I mean, assuming the tempo is the same, drumming can probably be within like an 8 to 10 minute uh, range, just depending on how quickly the processes elapse. Um, Assuming that the tempo is roughly the same. Music for 18 is a good bit more restricted than drumming is, but it still has that same general idea, but it's not because of phase processes, it's because of the pulses. The pulses are just basically given the freedom to, well, it's because of two things. The pulses are one thing. They're given the freedom to um, basically occupy their own loosely defined metric stratum, based on usually based on the breath. It's the singers and the clarinetists, although other instruments like the strings and even the pianos also take that role at times. But the phrases are the length of one breath, for the wind instruments and singers, um, typically, and so they have this nearly complete freedom to just sort of do that, and they're also the ones providing very often changes in the harmony, which is really interesting. Um, and so one of the things that just anecdotally, this piece was really important for me because it you know contains these really great examples, and I mean, like, anybody who is like a young music student should hear this piece and just see its diatonic language, because it is this like perfect little encapsulation of, you know, hey, if we have
extended chords, then all these types of diatonic um, harmonies are basically possible underneath a potentially kind of huge collection of maybe 5 or 6 melodic common tones, right? You might have melodic patterns that contain 4 or 5, 6 unique notes that are common tones to all the extended triads that describe the harmony. Um, and what that allows is for the harmony to be actually completely disjoint at times, although sometimes it's also very metric, very metered out in the same way that it is in music for mallets, voice, and organ. But it also exists very freely. To get back to the other source of um, just variance in the formal structure of music for 18, it's all based on cycles of different groups in the ensemble entering. So, similarly to drumming, like I said, there's not phase processes, um, but there are processes that a certain member of the ensemble will have to go through and complete, and that cues the next thing to start happening. And sometimes these overlap in interesting ways. Um, the other thing about music for 18 musicians that I think is worth mentioning is the expanded harmonic um, palette. You know, pieces like piano phase and violin phase, for organs, drumming, they all stick to a single key. Music for mallets, voice, and organ has very subtle key changes over its course. Um, I I want to say that it like gains 1 or 2 sharps over the course of 4 segments that each have their own little 2 chord harmony. Music for 18 musicians, I mean, for one thing, this is a 15-minute piece, and this is a 50-minute piece or an hour-long piece. But one of the really nice things about Music for 18 is that it contains this harmonic journey, right? It begins in D major and goes all the way out to either E major or B major. So it gains like 3 sharps, and then it comes back to D major. So there's this nice arc to the harmony, and it's all just achieved through rather usually quite subtle, but nonetheless effective common tone modulations from one section to the next. Um, it's actually so subtle that in the pulses sections at the beginning of the piece, and I'm just going to presuppose a certain level of familiarity with the piece with these comments. The only there are like really no obvious changes of key built in, right? I mean, like the pulses are all happily considered in 3 sharps, right? But then you have section 1 where it's obviously not 3 sharps, it's 2 sharps. That setback is what begins the journey, gaining more and more sharps until there's 4. I think it goes from 2 to 4. I think that's it. I don't think it ever gets a 5th sharp, but I don't know. It's been a long time since I looked at the score. Actually, yeah, no. I know that for a fact. However, now I'm thinking that I was wrong in saying that it just gains sharps. It goes 2 3 4 3 2. I think it's like maybe a little more complicated of a curve than that. It might be like 2 3 4 3 4 3 2. I don't know. It doesn't matter. And then some of the contiguous sections are in the same key. But when there is a key change, it happens between one section and the next, and that's a very 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 subtle contrast, but it's just enough to make the harmony of the next section kind of fresh. One of my favorite examples is when between I think it's section 5 and section 6. I don't remember the section numbers, but the section where the three pianos are playing the violin phase quotation, that gives way to this section. That must be section 4, and then section 5, the maracas enter, and the key changes from C sharp minor to F sharp minor. Um, you know, very, very subtle change of harmony. And it uses there's a lot of overlap. There's actually the big melodic gesture that defines section 5, whatever it is, the one with the maracas, or is it 6? I don't know. The second one of the two I'm talking about. That melodic gesture emerges in the section before, in the old key, but then it's in this new key, and so the focus changes, and it's really interesting. That kind of effect just really uh, um, it was the most important thing that I can say about it is that it just really, really spoke to my understanding of things as a beginner at that time. When I first heard this music. And I only knew a couple of really effective harmonic tricks. um, so my only complaint about Music for 18 is that it has a bit of an amorphous form. And for the most part, that's really nice. Things are freely allowed to sort of reoccur and vary on things that have happened previously, maybe a long time ago. Similar types of material are presented in varied ways, but it's not structured as variations. It's structured as a sequence of just, here's this section, here's this next section, here's this next section. And the relationships all just emerge kind of organically out of the limited melodic palette of the patterns that characterize each section. So I don't know. I mean, I haven't ever attempted a deep structural analysis of the piece, but it it's very freely structured. It gives the impression of being very freely structured. I think one thing that has been said about it is that the relationship between sections is like a familial relationship. They have their things. They have their various preoccupations, but they're sort of made of the same material. They're cut from the same cloth, so to speak. And that's a beautiful thing, but it's a kind of slightly flimsy premise to build an hour-long piece on, and that's okay because it's lovely music regardless. But it definitely kind of puts it in the category of and I mean, this is just one of the reasons why it still is an incredibly popular concert piece for anybody who can get so many musicians, and especially so many pianos. This is a piece that requires 4 pianos in the same room. It's incredibly popular. Excuse me. Incredibly widely performed. Perhaps uh, perhaps almost as much as clapping music. Um, uh, but the vibe is so, and this is this to loop back sort of to the this what I was saying at the beginning about It's Gonna Rain, right? About it being, an intense work of like avant-garde art, right? Music for 18 is just so much more accessible than that. And like on the more like harsh end of the critical spectrum, like I could say like, well, that's because it's boring, or it's because there's not as much content there, right? There's not as much there to think about. Um, you know, yeah, it's a more meditative experience. Um, I don't think I would say any of that necessarily, but I bring it up just as a reason why I'm conserving the S double plus spot. Because eventually we're going to get into things that are harmonically very, very interesting to me. Just in the way that the actual music, so much of this is, the minimalism, which relies on picking just the right thing to subject to the formal device or the process. Um, and from here on, we're going to get into stuff that uh, becomes much more overtly about uh, just being traditionally kind of intriguing music, right? We're going to get into some like jazz harmony territory. Uh, anyway, next we have variations for wind strings and keyboard, which um, is a piece that I actually really thought was retracted. Um, but it's actually not. It's here. It's here in the list. It's in my list and it's listed on his website. Um, I what to say about this piece? I feel similarly about this piece to how I feel about Mount's voice in organ, to where it has interesting content. It's really pleasant to listen to. It has interesting form. Um, not form isn't the word I'm looking for. The orchestra is disposed in a pretty interesting, albeit extremely repetitious way. Um, and actually, we need to talk about music for a large ensemble as well. And I will say that music for a large ensemble is basically a sequel to Music for 18. Um, uh, but I think I need to. I think I need to basically put that a tier lower than Music for 18, because it's just a little bit. I don't know. Well, it doesn't contain as much variety as Music for 18 does. Um, although the orchestration is a little bit expanded, um, there's quite a bit more like functional fixedness in the use of xylophones and pianos and marimbas. Um, and actually, now that I'm thinking about it, I might actually want to crunch this all down a little bit. Um, I do like Mallet's voice and organ a lot, and I do like large ensemble a lot, but I think I think they really belong on the same tier as all of these. Anyway, back to variations for wind strings and keyboards. I think it's definitely a solid C tier, if not a B. I'll put it in B because I think it's nice. The thing is that the variations kind of have this habit of not going anywhere, and there is this really elaborate harmonic layer, which is uh, um, it's really just not very like him as a composer. There's nothing quite like that in any other work. I mean, it's similar to the chord progressions in Mouth's Voice and Organ or Large Ensemble or Music for 18. Um, yeah, I just did that. Uh, and yet I still think we're gonna need this S plus plus eventually. It's similar to the roles of the drone chord progressions in those pieces, except it keeps going and going and going, and it actually is almost like the main melody of the piece, because the more active melodic lines are, repeated after just a few seconds, whereas the chord progression is this journey that keeps going and going and going and going through key changes. Um, so I don't know. I mean, it has a very um, there needs to be a nicer word for boring. It has a very kind of boring quality to the surface. Um, but there are interesting orchestrational ideas in there. Um, I don't know. Maybe I should actually put it down in C tier. I think I'll put that in C tier for now. We'll see. We'll see. We'll see what it becomes of this B tier here. I can't pick between Mallet's Voice and Organ and Music for a Large Ensemble, though. I'm thinking about denoting one of them, but I really do like them about the same. And Large Ensemble, part of the reason why I struggle to form an opinion about Large Ensemble is because there exist two versions of the pieces. There's a version that has a substantial edit, um, and so like it's a piece that if you really want to get to know it, you need to like find quite a few different recordings of it. Um, I think that one, two, or perhaps even one is like sufficient for a lot of these pieces. But with Large Ensemble, because there exists that huge version difference, I don't even have like a clear idea in my head of like how it goes. um, so I don't know. I struggle to form a valid opinion about that, but I really do think I like it about the same as Mallet's Voice and Organ. Although I find, well, so here's the thing: Large Ensemble uses the same kind of trope as Music for 18 does, where there's a vibraphonist whose job it is to play cues between sections. However, in addition to there being this cue person, um, which, by the way, the vibraphone parts in Music for 18 and Music for a Large Ensemble are garbage compared to the vibraphone part in Mallet's Voice and Organ. That is such a more interesting vibraphone part. I don't know why he kept it so uh, functionally fixed and just rigid, and just very extremely simple in Music for 18 and Music for a Large Ensemble. It's just that when you hear the vibraphone, it is always a cue, and its function is a little bit more folded into the entire ensemble texture in Mallet's Voice and Organ. But I think it makes it a much cooler part. Um, well, it still retains a bit of a cue quality, because so much of what it does in Mallet's Voice and Organ is play a long note on the downbeat, kind of like a gong or something. Uh, but anyway, the use of the vibraphone in Music for a Large Ensemble honestly feels a little extraneous compared to Music for 18, because the structure of Music for a Large Ensemble is somewhere in between Music for 18, the freedom of the structure of Music for 18 and the kind of very segmented structure of Mallet's Voice Organ. So I don't know. All right, we talked about variations for wind strings keyboard. We're coming up on Tehillim, and Tehillim is the first piece that I'm going to rocket just straight up to Ultra S tier.
Not even that. It's going to be 2 tiers above Music for 18. Tehillim is an incredible piece. And I mean, I've spent a lot of time with it as studying it very closely. The Oh boy, where do I even start with Tehillim? Um, well, the 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 texts are very very carefully chosen, very very nicely chosen. The treatment of the text is very nice. The harmonization of those treatments of the texts is very nice, and in the first movement and in the second movement, um, I especially get a sense for um, little rhetorical turning points in the text, reflecting in the harmony in a really beautiful way. Um, the harmonic language is just crazy, and it's actually a little too crazy. The composition is for singers who sing these short texts repeatedly, uh, and then a string quintet that plays um, chord progressions which accompany those vocal parts. Um, and usually that's like the extent of it. The voices are then doubled with wind instruments, and then there's a rather large battery of percussion. But so it becomes the job of this string quintet to support these really massive harmonies, and it honestly seems like it might be slightly too large of a job. Like, it would be safer to like double the string quintet with an electric organ, um, to shore up the intonation and uh, yeah, I don't know. Um, the string parts are really good, but in the weaker performances of Tehillim I've heard, they are usually what I'm missing. However, that being said, there are recordings of Tehillim, including the studio recordings, both the older one by Steve Reich's ensemble and the newer-ish one. I say newer-ish, but it's 15 or 20 years old. The Alarm Will Sound studio recordings, in which the strings are presented in just absolutely perfect shape, and they would have always required amplification, but even amplification can't kind of account for the benefit you get from like a real studio mastering of the strings. When the strings are presented in a mastered form, they are just so badass. They're killer. Um, yeah, one of my favorite things about the piece. But that being said, the voice parts, again, the voices are doubled with wind instruments, which is just very uh, wise orchestration and a nice way to kind of create variety in how the voices are accompanied. There's a basically there's a group of clarinets, and there's also a group of double reed oboes, English horns, and I think bassoon. So I mean, he colors the voices one way or the other, and also with electric organs. Sometimes there are two electric organs in the Tehillim ensemble, but they don't play chords; they play melodies. They double the voices, and so there's these three contrasting ways then that the voices are doubled, and that contributes a lot of sort of identity to the form. Um, Gosh, what else? What else is there to say about those? Um, there's just so uh, of the kind of diatonic harmonic tropes that we find in these other pieces.
Tehillim's got like a superset of all of them, right? It has the really straightforward stuff based on four that you can find in music for 18 musicians, but it also has the dominant 11th chord of four organs, or Odem Watermelons, which I won't stop talking about. Um, uh, it also contains the first altered dominant chord, although it's a diatonic altered. I think I call it the natural altered dominant because it's a five without a leading tone with a flat nine. So it still fits in the diatonic scale, but it's still a flat nine chord as well. So it's an um, interesting type of dominant chord and a very unique bit of edge that Tehillim employs. Um, Shortly hereafter, we'll get into pieces that are nothing but altered dominant chords. So uh, it's pretty neat. The harmonic language is just perfect. The rhythmic language is um, a little psycho. He does this thing in the mostly in the second movement. The other movements are not as bad. Um, Actually, no, it happens in the last movement as well. Um, there's there's canonic, there's unison canon processes, right? Where the voices might be played in two parts or in four parts in a round. Um, but in the second movement and in the final movement, there's also augmentation processes, similar to what happens in four organs. Um, and the augmentation process is really cool. But the thing is that Tehillim is based on these natural rhythms that come directly from the text, and so what that means is that he basically uses two-part beats and three-part simple beats and compound beats in a free alternation, depending on how he reads the text. And so you get these time signatures like 5/8, 6/8, 7/8, 8/8, 9/8, 4/8. All those time signatures in just totally variable combinations. But the thing is that then he applies an augmentation process in movements 2 and 4. And so what he does is he keeps the existing metric structure, but adds this layer of more beats to it. So after that, you get time signatures like 14/8 and 15/8 and 17/8 and 19/8, and I think it even goes as high as 28 at certain points. So I mean, like it is comically nightmarish to wrap your mind around that at first blush, but then you get pretty used to it. But that's one thing he hasn't done since Tehillim is um, uh, strictly uh, strictly preserve the barring of a section after it goes through an augmentation process. He'll rebar it using smaller time signatures in later pieces, which I think makes them a little more approachable. But I don't know. I just thought that was funny. The yeah, I don't know. I think I've probably said enough about Tehillim. It's great. Um, it everything about it is just like the emotional candor of it is very perfect. I obviously don't. Well, not obvious. Maybe I don't know. Maybe you think I'm fluent in Hebrew. I don't speak almost any Hebrew. But from the translations of the texts, they seem just extremely well treated to me. Every word. Um, yeah, I don't know. I'm not a religious person, but this is a piece that makes me feel like God is awesome. What do we have next? So next we have Vermont Counterpoint, which is interesting little piece for flute and tape. It's the first of the so-called uh, counterpoint pieces. So it's a piece for 11 flute parts, where the idea is that 10 of those parts are pre-recorded, and one of them is kind of special and is meant to be played live. So the effect is that the live player will play something which is then picked up by a pre-recorded part, and so they leave these kind of echoes in a way that the tape can sustain out for however long. And that's the basic formal idea about these uh, pieces that have counterpoint in the title. Um, Vermont Counterpoint is a really interesting piece, and it's probably one of the ones I'm going to be least confident about assigning a ranking to. um, I might. So one thing I'll say is that it's extremely virtuosic, which is interesting because your typical Steve Reich piece is pretty middling about the technical demands of the player. Like they're hard to play because you have to count a lot, right? You have to have a really good sense of rhythm, but they're not um virtuosic in the traditional sense. But that's not really the case with Vermont Counterpoint. There's these like flurries of lines on flutes and piccolos um that just really take advantage of that instrument's ability to do pretty rapid uh, uh, melodic stuff in a way that's still very articulate. Um, so I mean, it really impresses me for that reason alone. Uh, I don't know. I think I want to put this either here or maybe even here, but I think I'm gonna err on the side of, uh, and that might just be that I haven't listened to it enough times. But um, wow. Okay. This is interesting. The I'm so like not really like I could tell you the decade probably that most of these pieces were written in, but the specific chronology I had no idea. So here we are in 1983 with the Desert Music, um, which is another piece that I am going to put in Ultra S tier. Uh, Either here or here, and I think it's going to be here. Um, again, like with Tehillim, it's texted work for except whereas Tehillim is for singers and kind of a chamber ensemble. The Desert Music is for a uniquely composed orchestra. Um, Namely, to state it more specifically, it's for a choir uh, with an orchestra that is divided into three major groups. Um, of strings and woodwinds, and then a huge percussion section and a rather large brass section. Um, we still have sort of that sort of functional fixedness, um, and in fact, it's really much more obvious in some ways when he writes for orchestra that just how fixed in certain roles different groups are. It's kind of comparable to like variations for wind strings and keyboards in that way. But it's quite a bit more expansive in the orchestration than that piece. Speaking of the orchestration, though, my biggest gripe about the Desert Music is um, the orchestration, and to some extent, I believe that the piece was sort of seen as a failure because he really shied away from writing for orchestra to some extent after the Desert Music. Um, I think probably a lot of the earliest performances were not very good, um, just because of how um, demanding the rhythmic languages, and not just the rhythms, but also the harmonies. Because the Desert Music gets into interesting uh, harmonies where there's a really good description of it in the liner note, the program notes. So I mean, like, just go read the program note. You don't need me to tell it to you. Um, but the effect of having, cycles of altered dominant chords is that you're always in a kind of uh, rarefied place in whatever key you're in, right? Very often it has like some innate chromaticism or some innate kind of um, like upper structure to it. Um, which for the musicians gives a lot of tuning difficulties, which is um, uh, that challenge is eased somewhat by the prevalence of harmonic drones coming from the percussion section, from marimbas and vibraphones and pianos. But even still, for the strings and the woodwinds and to some extent the brass, although usually brass players are pretty good about that sort of thing. I have to give them props where props are due, and especially the singers. Especially for the singers, it is a really difficult piece. Not because the writing is super virtuosic, but because the demand is like nothing shy of rhythmic perfection, and also because the harmony is pretty complicated sometimes. Um, the great tragedy of the desert music is that some of the best expressions of the material are for me found in the reduced arrangements in the studio recordings, which, for instance, the Alarm Will Sound, Tehillim, and the Desert Music album. I believe that is the Michael Tilson Thomas reduced arrangement, which replaces it removes a lot of doublings, and it replaces, I think, some of the brass. Like it keeps like just a few brass for some of the most characteristic things, but then doubles them with electric organs, and I think also adds electric organ doublings for the voices in places. Um, the studio recording, and I mean the other thing about the Alarm Will Sound recording specifically is that the singers are just so bomb about hitting those tight like jazz harmonies. Um, they execute that stuff no problem, and uh, so that studio recording, the music is rendered in such a amazing way that it just never is in a live recording. But at the same time, those live performances are what are required to give like the scale of like epicness that the piece also kind of has built into it with the um uh the sort of the journey in the text. um uh the texts don't really cohere quite so much, but there's a few thematic through lines which are enough to make it a very powerful experience. I wouldn't put it on the same level as Tehillim in terms of the treatment of the text, but the texts are quite nice. I mean, they're great little fragments of poetry by William Carlos Williams, which is very very good, and the treatment of the texts I think is usually very good. Although there's a few moments where it's just like, I think it's better when it's usually set through. There's a couple of moments where texts are just repeated, and that always struck me as a little weird. Um, but so yeah, I mean, I'm almost tempted to ding this, a tier or half a tier or however we consider these ascended S tiers, um, because of the historically problematic orchestration. Um, but like, I don't know, I really love this piece. It's so cool. It has so many great moments. Um, yeah, I don't know. Enough said. Okay, so now let's get on to the next one. This is next we have 8 lines, which is also called Octet. Am I missing this? I can't be missing this. There it is. I'm stupid. Okay. 8 lines. It was originally called Octet because it was originally written for an octet. It was retitled 8 lines because it was rewritten for substantially more than 8 people. The original ensemble was actually really, really overworked. The original the original viola and cello parts were literally not possible as they were written. And the violin parts were also very difficult. They were constant double stops. And so, for the ease of keeping that in tune, it was later reorchestrated to have 8 string players rather than 4. And there's also like an implicit assumption that your 2 woodwind players can play both flute and clarinet. Or, one of them plays clarinet and bass clarinet, and the other one plays clarinet and bass clarinet and flute. So at least you need at least one woodwind doubler, I think. Actually, maybe both of them play flute. Yeah, I think both of them do play flute. So you need people who can play flute and clarinet. And the piano parts are also very hard. So, like, literally, it would make sense to play this piece with 16 people instead of 8, which I think is hilarious and just, I don't know. I don't want to just write that off as a orchestrational fail, but, well, the string parts are a bit of a fail. But yeah. Early on, though, I mean, the woodwinds actually were even a little bit interchangeable, which I didn't really realize until somewhat recently when I saw some like old footage of it being played with a bassoonist. I was like, what is that doing in there? um, so, what to say about 8 lines? Oh, I wanted to just comment that Tehillim has that same problem with the strings, of there being just a little bit too much double stops. And it's not just the fact that there's these double stops, it's the fact that it's like sustained and needs to be really perfectly in tune. So I mean, for me, if I were putting together, my dream realization of Tehillim, I would probably just increase the number of string players, like quite a bit, and orchestrate out the double stops in the violin part. So same deal with 8 lines in a lot of ways, really. 8 lines has a really interesting energy to it. Harmonically, it's in a similar place to something like Violin Phase, but like Music for 18, it does have like very subtle key changes that are accomplished by these common tone modulations. I don't know. I'm tempted to demote it to B tier, but I think I need to put it in A tier. It's pretty fun. I mean, I know I've been complaining about the orchestration this whole time, but really it's used to great effect in this piece. And I'm sure that when it was originally written, he had really virtuosic players who could pretty much do everything he wrote. But yeah. So I've complained about the orchestration a lot, but I will also say that it has some really good orchestrational effects, especially the woodwind players. I mean, the bass clarinet parts are a joy, and the flute parts are great. Another really interesting thing about the especially the flute. Well, I don't know. It affects the flute melodies a lot, and it also affects the chord progressions. But the piece is in 5, and that 5 is broken up in different ways, right? So I mean, like, you might have a phrase that's like, say, 20 bars long, maybe that 20 is 6 plus 6 plus 4 plus 4, right? Or maybe it's, 5 plus 10 plus 5. There's interesting subdivisions and superdivisions going on with the time signature, that I don't know, I won't get into too much, but it's just very interesting, and the whole piece is just so lively rhythmically. I mean, it's that's a pretty constant element to all of these pieces, of course, but the way it's accomplished in terms of the actual parts, uh, in 8 lines, I think is kind of unique. Um, or maybe I shouldn't say unique, but novel compared to the other works we've talked about already. So our next work is the Sextet for Percussion and Keyboards. Um, it's just called Sextet. This is like a classic. I mean, so for me, like I think I alluded to this at the very outset here. Um, a great deal of the appeal of all of this for me is the fact that I am a mallet player, and the sextet has a lot of mallet instruments. It has two people who are pretty much devoted to playing vibraphone all the time, and there's also three marimbaists who have various other responsibilities. I think only the first and fifth movement actually use the marimbas, and the other times they're playing bass drums or, less cool instruments. But I don't know. The reservation of the marimbas is actually a pretty effective decision overall, I think. What to say about the sextet? Well, let's not force ourselves to say something. The important thing is, how do I rank it? And this A tier is getting pretty full, TBH, but I think it has to go in A tier. Yeah, I think that's like a straightforward defining my idea of an A tier piece. Um, and I might actually have to split this A tier into 2 tiers, but we'll see. It's okay to have a ginormous bump in your distribution, of course. Um, our next work is another A tier. New York Counterpoint. This is the next piece in the vaguely delineated counterpoint series. Um, New York Counterpoint is for uh, 11 clarinet parts, much like Vermont Counterpoint was for 11 flute parts. But New York Counterpoint is a little more straightforward, or no, I shouldn't say straightforward. Whereas Vermont Counterpoint gives very strongly the impression of a piece um, written for like almost a repeat pedal on the live flute. New York Counterpoint engages with that as like a formal, like processual idea, but also has much more kind of overt orchestrational uh, content than that. And the best example of what I'm trying to say when I say that is the fact that two of the clarinets are bass clarinets. So there is kind of like a dedicated bass part um, to the um, to the ensemble, which is not the case in Vermont Counterpoint. Um, yeah, for the sake of brevity, I don't think I need to expound about this piece anymore. It's nice, it's cool, it's you know, it definitely makes some smart use of the clarinet. Um, if I were a clarinetist, it would have great appeal to me. Um, Although I might not want to actually put in the work of playing it myself. uh, Next, we have three movements for orchestra. This is a piece that this is a piece that I cannot find in the list. I'm gonna have to pause again and create an image for this. I think I am. All right, hang on a second. All right, never mind. I'm just stupid. I didn't see it. It's right at the top. Okay, three movements for orchestra. What to say about this? Well, I'm tempted to put it in A tier. However, I'm also tempted to put it in S tier. But that makes me think maybe I should put one of these in S tier. I think I can conclusively say that Music for 18 should be a tier above Mallet's Voice and Organ, as well as Large Ensemble. But three movements is kind of uniquely cool. The use of the orchestra. So I mean, he has the orchestra disposed antiphonally, which is really cool. I mean, it's not very traditional use of the orchestra, but it takes the sort of pulse idea, these rapid repeated eighth notes, basically sounding out very slowly evolving chorale. And he applies it to the whole orchestra, and he maintains that with this kind of idea of there being a very large battery of percussion, which is supposed to be situated right in front of the conductor, which I don't know how good of an idea that is or not, honestly. If they were in the back, then they would be hearing one constant rhythmic direction. I feel like having them right in front of the conductor, because the way he words it in the program notes is that having the percussion right in front of the conductor gives the rest of the orchestra a unified rhythm to both hear and see, right? But I feel like that kind of comes at the expense of not caring, or if the orchestra is maybe a little late, if the people furthest away from the conductor. And I mean, in fairness, most of the parts, like the part writing in three movements, is actually not at all non-conducive to that. In fact, I think that in a piece like the Desert Music, it's a big problem, but in three movements, it is actually very much like in line with what the material is. So, I don't know. Do I want to bump this up to S tier? Like, in the grand scheme of things, I feel like this piece is like a natural A tier. But I might just put it in S tier because I like it. It uses the orchestra really effectively, in my opinion. And the harmony is also very cool. I haven't been really commenting on that so much, but so this is also a little surprising to me. We have three movements for orchestra in 1986, and then the four sections for orchestra in 1987. Four sections is interesting. For me, um, I kind of don't like most of it. Like, there's interesting parts to it, but a lot of the time, I feel like the more varied orchestration actually kind of does it a disservice, right? Like we've talked about how most of these pieces rely on a very very strong sense of like functional fixedness in the orchestration, and the more sort of varied contributions that the different sections make is kind of uh I don't know, it just doesn't really it somehow doesn't stick the landing for me in the four sections for whatever reason. Um with one huge exception, which is that the movement for it's in four movements, each movement being based on the four sections of the orchestra. The section devoted to woodwinds and brass is really really good. Um, it has an interesting rhythmic ploy over the course of the movement where it's used to facilitate this metric modulation. There's a metric modulation that happens halfway through that movement, which connects the previous movement to the subsequent movement, in terms of their tempi. So like that's cool. Um, and I don't know. The other thing is I feel like the percussion writing is just a little boring, and part of that is an attempt to incorporate more traditional expectations of orchestral percussion. I think this is one of the only times he's ever written a timpani part. It might be the only time there's ever been a timpani part. And it's a pretty good timpani part, actually. Um, but like, it's a little bit, like compared that with like the antiphonal bass drums in the sextet, and it's like to me that's a lot more interesting, while still being just a very kind of traditional percussion stuff kind of part. So I don't know. I think I'm actually going to put four sections in B tier. Uh, I don't know. It's not bad, but um the next oh shoot. I think I did research about this and was unclear on my findings. Oh, okay. Never mind. Okay, yeah, because I'm on his website. The next piece listed is four strings with wind and brass, with a date of 1987 stroke 2004. Um, I eventually discovered that that is just the strings movement from the four sections excerpted, and apparently it was revised in 2004. So I haven't heard that revision. Um, I will say the strings movement of four sections is a little bit divisive because it's the beginning of the piece, and yet it's also very boring. It's just like I use the word boring a lot, um, out of necessity, right? I mean, it's one of the only words in my vocabulary to describe unideal results of extreme repetitiousness, which is a feature of all of this music, right? So it's like, you know, but this is the first time I'm actually saying the word boring and really meaning it. The first movement of four sections is kind of boring. Um, and yeah, it received this revision, which I haven't heard, but anyway, I'm not going to consider that separately. Next, we have Electric Counterpoint, which is probably the most sort of standout, famous work under the counterpoint umbrella because it, um, well, it's for electric guitar, and it's quite widely performed, from what I've been able to sort of gather. Um, Structurally, it's like a pretty straightforward repeat of New York Counterpoint. The material is very dissimilar, but the form is almost identical, and that is such a striking quality of it that I've actually written pieces that have that identical form. More than one piece that has this identical form as well. I'm gonna just slap that in A tier along with New York Counterpoint. Which one of those do I like more? Hard to say. If I had to pick one, it would probably be New York Counterpoint, but Electric Counterpoint is also very good. Okay, next we have Different Trains. Without much deliberation, I'm gonna stick it in S tier, and then I'm going to think about maybe moving it up or down one. The the orchestration of Different Trains is a little bit notorious. It's for 3 string quartets or one live string quartet that has pre-recorded 2 copies of itself, and that serves 2 purposes. One is it allows the string quartet to play 4 sets of string quartets, or 3 sets of string quartets. My mistake. But the other thing is that the tempo in Different Trains changes all over the place because it uses these voice clips, and the strings have to match to the voice clip, and so having a pre-recorded part from the string quartet means they can maybe do it in different tapes, maybe have a bunch of different click tracks. Probably not, but they can get a pre-recorded copy that has a degree of somewhat superhuman perfection to the tempo changes. So really, I mean, the orchestration is very smart. I will say that, well, okay, there's 2 things. Firstly, I haven't ever undertaken a close study of the harmony in Different Trains, but I will say that it seems a little bit on the simple side. The incorporation of speech melody is obviously remarkable, and both the thematic content of the texts, which I won't get into for not bringing the mood down too much purposes. Its disposition throughout the piece is really good, very effective. And not only that, but I think I have to say that it displays just enough like self-awareness about how funny of a thing to do that is, to incorporate bits of speech into a piece of music. I don't know, the just the there's a few things that come to my mind throughout the piece that are like uh mm, not jokes, but I think madrigalisms would be perhaps the right way of thinking about them, uh, or lamp shading between the sort of text and the superstructure of the piece. Um, that just makes it really remarkably authentic, despite the just wild inauthenticity just latent in the idea of taking bits of speech out of context and incorporating and then stringing them back together into a narrative for a piece of music. So it comes across as just remarkably authentic. um and that's also a quality that goes for pieces like It's Gonna Rain and Come Out. Less so for My Name Is. But in Different Trains, it really, I don't know, it contributes greatly, I think, to its um, home run factor, its ability to knock it out of the park. The other thing is that the string quartet is uh, one of these genres that has this history of being just remarkably articulate. And to some extent, I feel like that potential is a little bit wasted in different trains because so much of what they do is just chug out paradiddles. um, it's almost like I wish the it's almost like there exists a little bit of a power imbalance between the musicians and the um, pre-recorded tape spoken material, and like obviously like you're gonna have to have that to a degree, and I don't know what I don't have a better solution in mind, more interesting sorts of variety that would be appropriate to insert into the string parts. But it is a little bit strange how backgrounded the actual performers are in different trains. And when we get to well, as we go on, I might have a more uh, I might have a enhanced version of that gripe about another piece. Um, Incredibly enough, different trains 1988. Right after that, we have The Cave, which is his first opera. Um, the Cave is a completely bizarre piece of music, and it is a piece for which, unfortunately, there are no really good recordings available. Um, there is one studio recording out there that I know of, but it doesn't include the video. Obviously, it's an audio recording. And there's never been a DVD release because the way the opera is staged, it's a video opera, which at the time, the early '90s, that was quite a novelty. The idea of having a through composed, you know, music theater piece with a just a constant video element. Um, the video, of course, done by Beryl Corot. Um, it was designed to be played on 5 screens simultaneously, and so there's not like a satisfactory way to record a video of it. I've seen little excerpts of performances, but there hasn't been a really good release that includes the video. And I think that the music, like the studio version of the music, it has major things omitted from it. So it's almost like I've never actually fully experienced this piece. The types of content divide really starkly in The Cave into bits where they focus on interview footage, which they did. They did a lot of really impressive field work, gathering interview material for The Cave. Movements which are dictated, for which the form is dictated by that, and then movements which are more, I guess, like arias, where it's bits of biblical texts, set to music for the singers and ensemble. I'm just gonna stick it in A tier and not stress about it too much. Because there's a lot I don't know about this piece. It has some really interesting stuff. It also has, to me, on my first listen to it, I questioned it a lot, actually, because I did not understand what was happening with the treatment of the voices, of the pre-recorded voices, the interview footage. Uh, it's weird. It's really weird. I mean, like, if like for me, my with the age I am, right, things like this and like different trans remind me of like YouTube poop, right? Which is why I sort of made this point about, you know, it's actually really important the way that uh these pieces do establish like authenticity about what they're doing. Um, uh, or yeah, or another what I should say is establish a sense of authenticity, in spite of what they're doing, I should say. Um, like I mean, there's very little YTP aspects in different trains, but like in the cave, there's a lot of it. And like sometimes, I mean, there's like a few like genuine like laugh out loud moments in the cave. Like different trains, there's a few things that make me smile, like where the, you know, it goes from saying 1 year to saying the next year, or what have you. And then of course, I, I thought about mentioning when the when I was talking about it earlier, but of course the very end of different trains is very very touching. Uh, the cave has some laughs in it, and that's not something that I can say about almost any of these other pieces. I don't think. Um, I don't know. It's wild. Anyway, let's go ahead and move on. We have the duet for two violins and orchestra. This is a really nice piece. I think it's a solid A tier. It might even be an S tier for me. Um, it's just these two violins. They play things that are mostly unison canons. Um, then that is turned around and subjected to an augmentation process, and they're accompanied by these pulsating chords in a string orchestra. Um, in the right, like this is a piece for which like I have to imagine the concert programming like context for it, right? Like you have two violinists in your in your string section in your orchestra, right, who just really want to do this work, and so they, you know, do this, and then there's this really easy orchestra part that everyone else can just get and play the accompaniment. Um, yeah, uh, it's just really nice. It's beautiful. Yeah, I'm not sure what else to say. So now we have Nagoya marimbas, which is a duet for two marimbas. It's one of the very most like through composed types of things. Um, it it is like most things. I mean, it's based on these very rhythmically charged melodic cells that are in unison canon between the two players. But the way the cells vary over the course of the piece is just really organic. You know, you might have a melody that ascends, right, and then that ascent is carried out to like the next step, right? It continues in the next evolution of that melodic phrase, right? The range increases a little bit, or the time signature changes. There are some like interesting like lengthening and shortening uh, that happens um, in these repeated cells, and I think that the well, I don't know. I shouldn't even. I don't know. So it's a cool piece, but it's not as cool as this other stuff I have in A tier, so I'm dropping it in B tier. Um, okay, now we have Proverb for voice and ensemble. Proverb is a really cool piece. It takes a very short text. It it I it didn't have like the same immediate appeal for me as a lot of these did. Um, it has a bit of a um, oh, I don't know how to describe it. Whatever I said about variations for wind strings and keyboards, where the electric organ is kind of like it gives everything this sort of smoothness, which is nice, but not really necessary when it comes to establishing harmonic fields. Um, so like it's a little unnecessary and can make things a little boring. But I think I'm gonna put Proverb in S plus because I really, really, really like the treatment of the text, and I like the form of the piece a lot. He the writing is for, I think, I want to say, three sopranos and two tenors, and it includes these bits which are styled after like medieval organum, like Notre Dame organum, and those bits are so cool. They're really interesting. They're very touching because it always involves a stopping of the harmony. Right, the text is presented in a certain way. It has a harmony to it, and then it reaches these points at which it's just sustained, and then there's this little organum style, invention on top of that. And one of the coolest things that happened, one of my very favorite things, is that is presented in the two tenors, and then it's represented in the two vibraphones in a unison canon, where each of the vibraphones plays both of the tenor parts in a canon, and like, I don't know, it's just so epic. Another thing that's epic in Proverb is there's a big key change. The melody from the beginning, the main melody is this um uh how do I say, what do I say here? Basically, there's a second in the second half of the piece. The melody is roughly turned upside down, and that entails a key change. Um, and it achieves this kind of novel harmonic area, which in the context of the whole piece is like exceptionally cool and touching. Um, I don't know. It's one of those pieces that the more I hear it, and the more different performances of it I've heard, and there are variable performances out there. It is a very difficult piece because of the degree of just like virtuosity in the singing, especially. But it is made somewhat doable by the fact that you have the electric organ, or I think it's actually two electric organ parts, providing reference pitches. The orchestration is really very friendly, but it's just still quite difficult. That might be an S plus for me. Next we have City Life, which is the only piece that he's written for a chamber ensemble, which includes a sampler keyboard. Um, like obviously we have a lot of occupation with combining um, pre-recorded material with instrumental material, with live material, but also combining pre-recorded voices and speech with either using speech as music, in the case of It's Gonna Rain, or integrating it into an instrumental ensemble in cases like Different Trains or The Cave. Um, City Life is kind of like yet another solution to that, right? You have a sampler who can just trigger a sample, and they're a performer in the ensemble. There is nothing pre-recorded well, obviously there is. It's yeah. It's a sampler. They can trigger the samples at the appropriate time in the music, like any other member of the ensemble. It's just that they have this bank of different things. Um, City Life is a very, very appealing piece. It has, I actually kind of associated, I guess, with Eight Lines in that way, just how um, intriguing and appealing the surface texture is. Um, One thing about City Life that's a little bit of a downside is that the uh, the first movement is just so standout, incredible, that the other four, because there's four more after that, um, are just a little less fun by comparison. And that's also part of the narrative arc of the whole piece. By the end, it uh, comes to encompass recordings of you know uh, emergency uh, services personnel, like radio chatter from like the 1992 World Trade Center bombing. So there's a little bit of a downer ending to the entire piece. It feels like it's it has maybe appropriately like cynical outlook on what it means to live in the city. um, but the the roles that the sampler plays in the ensemble are varied in a way that's pretty um, that really is rather compelling. Um, Sometimes you have it playing kind of a rhythmic role. Sometimes it's a melodic role. Sometimes it acts kind of like percussion, like orchestral percussion. Playing crash cymbals or bass drums or stuff of that nature. Um, and sometimes it's a very structural rhythmic role, like in the second and fourth movements, where it plays the sounds of pile drivers or the sounds of heartbeats. Um, Sometimes it plays a rhythmic role, which is the primary focus in the third movement. The third movement is all based around set of like clapping music permutations handled by the synthesizer or the sampler, I mean, which is really fun. Um, uh, what else can I say about City Life? I don't know. It's just very solid. It's very solid. Next we have Triple Quartet. I really really like Triple Quartet. It's going up in S plus because I need to make my screen a little bit taller. Hang on a second. I'll make it a little taller. And I guess I can make it a little. Well, no, the width is basically what I wanted. I guess I'll just scrunch it down a little bit and hope that the text remains readable. I bet that'll be okay. Anyway, Triple Quartet has a similar harmonic ploy to Three Movements for Orchestra, where it's based on four altered dominant chords that are built in keys related by a diminished seventh chord. So it cycles through keys related by minor thirds. But the interesting thing is that whereas in Three Movements, it's more just about proceeding through the cycle over and over again, Triple Quartet builds a more complex form out of it. Um, in the first movement, the cycle is just traversed cyclically, but then the second movement takes place entirely in one key. And then in the third movement, it goes like A B C A B C D, or A B C D A, I should say. Um, so like you have this kind of building up of tension through further and further uh, keys in the cycle. Um, in the third movement. So I think it's really cool. Uh, it is, for the most part, I have a similar gripe with it as I have with different trains, which is that it feels like the strings aren't really um, engaged as much as they should be. However, it's a lot better in triple quartet than it is in different trains, and it is actually way better, specifically in the second movement. I would particularly recommend listening to the second movement of triple quartet, because it's really incredible, and it's a very nice kind of harmonic study on like a single area that's kind of defined by like a harmonic minor scale. Um, I don't know. It's really something. Some of the most interesting like melodic um, and not just melody but harmonized melodies, right? Like um, parallel melodies. Um, that's something you see in pieces like New York Counterpoint, The Desert Music, um, 8 lines. Situations where there are multiple melodies that have the same rhythm. Uh, so it's kind of like melody and direct harmony. Um, Triple Quartet is one of the most stellar examples of that, I think. So I think that that's S plus for me. All right, so now we're in 1999. We have Know What Is Above You. Um, uh, Know What Is Above You is a really small kind of piece. It's relatively short, and it's for a group which is almost like a dramatically reduced version of like the Tehillim ensemble. It contains the small drums used in Tehillim, and I think it's for two. No, it's for three, maybe four. No. I don't know. Know What Is Above You is for either 2 or 4 singers, and it might actually be 3, but probably not. Um, and 2 people playing the small drum. Uh, it's just really interesting. The vocal harmony uh, is a little bit more sophisticated than what you see in Tehillim. It kind of reminds me of the vocal arias from The Cave. Those are really great, by the way. If you listen to anything from The Cave, listen to the movements, which are settings of Bible verses. I think there's like 3 or 4 of them over the course of the opera. Um, uh, I don't know. I think I might just have to slap this in A tier, and maybe we'll try and disambiguate this tier a little bit, but that might have to that might be a task for the very end. But we'll see. Uh, I think that's enough said about Know What Is Above You. I don't know. It's really cool. The vocal parts are nice. Um, uh, so next on our list, we're in 2002, and now we have Three Tales, which was a monolithic effort to put together. They did again a ton of more interview work, similar to The Cave. Although this time they got a lot of really famous people to um, to comment on various things. Um, I love Three Tails. I make everybody I know watch Three Tails. I'm putting it in that double S. It's just really really intriguing. Um, the thematic content is managed like perfectly. Uh, I especially would recommend Act 3, which is where all the interview footage is. But from like the video art perspective, Acts 1 and 2 are also both really stellar, and Act 1 particularly, the arias in Act 1, the first and last scenes of Act 1, uh, are really really worth listening. I think, because of the integration of voice into the ensemble, it's actually, I think, more sophisticated. Well, okay, so one thing that he plays with in Three Tails is Paul stretching, right? Like that was kind of novel at the time, because before digital algorithms for it, you couldn't just take a recording and slow it down, right? If you took a tape recording and slowed it down, it would also lower the pitch, until the point where it just doesn't respond anymore. Um, but with an algorithm, you can slow down a voice, and in Act 1 of Three Tails, the slow down voice is totally haunting and weird and like just uh, really fascinating. Um, I don't, and not to mention like thematically cogent and appropriate. Um, I actually, now I'm trying to think if there's another instance where he's specifically used like slowed down voices, and I don't think there is outside of Three Tails. I really don't think there is. Huh. Anyway, I don't have, I guess, maybe a whole lot more to say about it. There's some interesting harmony. There's some really cool vocal writing in Three Tails, like really, really, really good stuff. Um, Although mostly, with the exception of like the Act 1 quote unquote arias that I mentioned, they are usually quite like subservient to the uh, to the text of the recorded voices. Right, they usually just kind of echo them, but those echoes are harmonized really interestingly sometimes. Um, and I think that actually kind of gets us into another piece, which is not next on the list, but I'm tempted to just jump there right now, but I guess we won't. Um, Next, we have dance patterns. Dance patterns was like a very very minor kind of work. It's for two pianos, two vibes, two xylophones. Um, and I really like it. I like it a lot. It's definitely, kind of modest in scope, but I don't know. It's cool. It's cool and it's groovy. Um, okay, cello counterpoint. I think this is the last of the entries in the so-called counterpoint series, and it is the least. It's really the oddest one out of all of them because, listening to it, one really doesn't get a sense that the live cellist is controlling the flow of the music. It really plays out much more like a piece for 9 cellos or however much it is than a piece for one performer and tape. And I actually have seen it performed with however many personnel it really takes. all live, and it works quite well that way as well. Um, you also see that with the other counterpoint pieces sometime, or I haven't seen Vermont counterpoint that way, but I've seen New York counterpoint and electric counterpoint that way, and it usually works quite well. Um, Although it probably generally works a little bit less well than the tape option. Um, yeah, there isn't a star player in cello counterpoint as there is in the other ones. Um, the other thing worth noting is that it is just incredibly virtuosic, right? I mean, like the Vermont. I mentioned about Vermont counterpoint earlier too. That it is quite virtuosic, and not to say that electric counterpoint and New York counterpoint aren't, but just in terms of like material difficulty, like the execution has to be perfect, right? So it's not like they're easy, but like the material is quite a bit more modest in those two. Cello counterpoint is just all over the place, and almost pushes the envelope a little too far, I think, in terms of um, the role of the person who has to play bass notes, right? It takes up a huge portion of the register, um, and the part writing down there also gets stale, I think, over the course of the piece. Um, Although it does have some there is like a contrapuntal voice in the second movement. That is kind of in that sweet register, the middle register, the middle low register of the cello. Very much of the parts are super high in the register, which you know uh, makes sense. You would need that if you're having that many parts, and they do some cool stuff a lot of the time. Um, I don't know. I think I'm gonna put it in A tier, and I'm definitely going to have to split A into two different tiers. um, all right, next we have 2004 UR Variations. The UR Variations is probably an S plus for me. I really love this piece. I didn't know until recently that it actually requires 4 pianos. I always assumed it was 2, but it's 4, which is ridiculous. Um, but like when at this point, like there is like the music for 18 ensemble, right? It requires 4 pianos. If you're programming that on a concert, you could just also have UR Variations. UR Variations has what are to me some extremely touching bits of harmony. Um, the third movement is quite interesting. Um, the structure is actually quite similar to Tehillim. Well, no, not really. I mean, it's 4 movements. The second movement of UR Variations is so good. Um, it's an augmentation process, and I believe there's 3 phases to it. It starts with the most condensed statement of this melody, and then it gets augmented, and then it gets augmented again, uh, with a couple of very very small like melismatic additions to the melody. Um, and like that movement is just so incredible. I've actually thought recently about performing it myself, um, with but I mean, like, yeah, obviously, like that presents a lot of difficulty. Um, yeah, I don't know. I just really like this piece. I don't know what else to say about it. It's really sweet. Um, it might have a little bit of a um, I don't know. And then immediately after this, 2005, we have Variations for Vibes, Pianos, and Strings, which is a piece for 3 vibraphones, 3 pianos, and 3 string quartets. Or they might not be string quartets. They might be like six violins and three cellos or something. I don't actually know. I think it is three string quartets. Um, not frequently played because of the kind of wacky orchestration, but it is a really really good piece. Again, we have like the diminished seventh chord cycle of harmony. Um, One thing is that at this point, there's a little bit of what I feel is a bit of a breakdown in. People expect these, or well, I shouldn't say that. So many of the multi-movement works are in an arch form, right? It's three movements, fast, slow, fast, or it's five movements, fast, slow, moderate, slow, fast, or something like that. Um, these symmetrical forms, and in variations for vibes, pianos, and strings, the second and third movements, um, or not even, I shouldn't even say that, the balance of energies between the different movements is just a little strange for reasons I can't articulate. Um, I also kind of yeah. I think my opinion is that the first movement is the most interesting because it has this whole process where um, melodies are gradually filled out, which is a process I didn't actually mention up until now, but it began in music for 18 musicians. You have a repeating context, and a new part is introduced one note at a time over repetitions. Right? They'll play one note out of their part, and then they'll play two, and then they'll play three, until the whole part is there. Um, and Variations for vibes, pianos, and strings is I think probably the most interesting example out of everything of a use of that process. Um, and that's a little bit exclusive to the first movement. I think it also happens in the third movement, but I'm not sure. All right, so now we come to Daniel Variations, 2006. Daniel Variations is a large work in orchestration, or it's for a work for a large chamber ensemble, and is large in scope. It contains, well, yeah, I won't summarize the sort of narrative pretext of the work, but uh, it's interesting. It's also written for four pianos and four vibraphones, which is like, if you thought four pianos was a lot, four vibraphones is a lot. Like, you don't see four vibraphones in the same place outside of like a drum corps. Um, uh, I'm trying to think. There's other pieces that have kind of a similar ploy in the string writing. Uh, but now I don't know about that. Well, okay, so Triple Quartet kind of has similar string writing going on. Daniel Variations is a piece I like a lot. I've listened to it a lot. Um, uh, Lots of really really touching vocal parts. It's actually, I think, really stellar voice writing. Um, do I bump it up to S tier is the question, and the answer is maybe not, honestly. Um, it is a piece with a big wow factor because of the ginormous bank of pianos and vibraphones. Um, but yeah, I don't know. So now we come to 2007, Double Sextet. Double Sextet is a piece that I slept on for a long time, so it won a Pulitzer Prize. And when I first heard that, my opinion was that they just wanted to give him a Pulitzer Prize for something, and this was like the most recent thing there was. Um, so I didn't have a super positive opinion of the work, and the main reason was that the way the writing is, right? I mean, so it's double sextet. The sextet is a piano, a vibraphone, a violin, a cello, a flute, and a clarinet, and it's 2 copies of each of those 6 instruments. And the writing for the winds and strings, like again, we have this sort of this functional fixedness, right? The pianos and the vibraphones provide like a rhythm section, and everybody else provides everything else. And my initial impression of everything else was that it was like too much for the individual instruments. Like it was just kind of like a mud almost. Uh, he very often has the flute, clarinet, violin, and cello playing a like 4 contiguous notes. Um, and it struck me as being like, I mean, so except you remove the pianos and vibraphones and you're left with 8 parts, and I just didn't get a sense for them contributing that much, despite accounting for so many people. And the other thing is that the actual distinction between the string parts and the wind parts is actually very subtle, and really a lot of the time extremely clever. You know, he'll have the clarinet play a part that really you know, expands the sound of the strings by having it be between the violin and the cello, or underneath the cello, underneath everything. Or he'll have the flute play something that is going to be a little more piercing sometimes. And so like as I've heard better and better recordings of it, that's one thing, and also just listen more closely. Um, there really is actually quite a bit of nuance to those parts, and the um, yeah, the sort of the harmonic obsession in double sextet is for these diatonic tetrachords, contiguous tetrachords, um, and that's something that goes back to UR variations, and maybe even a little earlier. But in double sextet, you see it disposed in a sort of compelling variety of ways, in the pianos, and then also in the strings and winds. My complaint about double sextet could be summarized as like, I feel like the rather than a quartet of flute, clarinet, violoncello, it could just be 2 electric organs. But I don't think I would say that. Easy S tier. Maybe not S plus. So now we move on to the mallet quartet. Obviously, my bias is going to be very pro mallets. The language here is very similar to double sextet, but I think I'm going to put it 1 tier higher because there's a really great amount of melodic invention in mallet quartet. It's really very much like 8 lines, in the level of virtuosity. And yeah, one interesting little tidbit about mallet quartet is Um, very sparse second movement. Um, it's unusual for his writing, um, and it's unusual for mallet instruments generally because they're percussion instruments that need to they need to say something and let it go and be done with it. They can't modify what they're playing after they've played it, right? Um, well, not so much, not to the degree you can on a string or woodwind or whatever. Um, so to have that rather sparse texture in the second movement is really very, very cool. Um, uh, yeah, I don't know. I just think that's a very strong piece. It's definitely the most virtuosic vibrant. Well, there's also the quartet from 20. What is it? 2014, 20 something, 2017, 2013 quartet for two pianos and two vibraphones. The mallet quartet is for two vibraphones, two marimbas. Uh, I was about to say mallet quartet probably the most virtuosic vibraphone parts that he's ever written. Um, the ones in the 2013 quartet for two pianos and two vibraphones are more varied in their demands, but I think they might be just also a little more idiomatic. Um, yeah, no, it's hard to compare the two. They're definitely on a similar level. Anyway, so we'll get to that eventually. The 2013 quartet. Um, Next, we have 2x5, which is a piece for two rock and roll quintets of lead guitar, rhythm guitar, bass guitar, piano, and drum set. Really nifty ensemble. It's a really cool piece. I think I gotta put this in S plus. Um, I take that back. I don't gotta put that in S plus. That can just go in S. That's an amazing piece. Um, all right, I'm gonna have to rearrange my windows a little bit here to stay. To stay in view of everything we need to talk about still. Um, so here in 2010 we have WTC 911, which has that entire piece is a little bit like tainted by like the fact that it's like, oh, it's a sequel for Different Trains, or it's a sequel to City Life. Um, it does have a lot. I mean, one thing about it is that it has a really, really striking personal dimension. It's a lot of like just personal acquaintances of the composer, which was actually, I mean, that was also the case in Different Trains at least once. Um, that's something that lends authenticity and just um, a certain ethos to the artistic procedure and the artistic merit and the authenticity of what is a very, like I said before, a very artificial um, kind of procedure. I don't know. I'm tempted to dump this in A tier and just not talk about it. um, it hmm. Yeah, I'm content with that. Um, Next, we have Radio Rewrite, which is really cool. Steve Reich discovered this kind of obscure British indie band called Radiohead, and in 2012 he wrote this piece that really kind of introduced them to a much wider audience. Um, I think he was acquainted with them somewhat because the guitarist from Radiohead had played Electric Counterpoint, his guitar piece. So Radio Rewrite, a little strangely enough, like he had written 2 x 5, and then Radio Rewrite has 0 of the rock and roll elements. There's no drum set, there's no guitar, there's no bass guitar. Wait, no, there is a bass guitar. What am I saying? There is a bass guitar in Radio Rewrite, and it's great. It mostly just doubles the piano left hand, but it's still a pretty nice part, and it's just a great little touch to the sound of the ensemble. I mean, it's mostly a very standard kind of Steve Reich ensemble. It's pianos and strings. I think there's also one flute and one clarinet, and vibraphones, of course. Radio Rewrite is a little bit more recently. I've been having trouble listening to it because of how almost sort of brutalistic the repetitious elements of it are, which is weird to say because I mean, really, the repetitiousness has only become more and more finessed over the years. But that being said, like there are some serious like grooves in this piece. I'm tempted to put it in S tier. Just because of how nice a lot of the melodies are, and just how well the piece conveys its energy. But I don't think I really like it as much as those other things in there. That's tricky. You know what? I think it's time that we do this business. We're gonna cycle the colors. Make this the pinkish red. Make this the purplish pink. Make this the pinkish purple. Yeah, perfect. Okay. We'll just call this A+ for the sake of backwards compatibility. And we're going to put Radio Rewrite in here. We're going to put the duet in here. We're going to put It's Gonna Rain in here. We're going to put drumming in here. We're going to put 8 lines in here. And we're going to put New York Counterpoint, but not Electric Counterpoint. We're going to put City Life. We're going to put Cello Counterpoint. We're not going to put Daniel Variations. We are going to put Violin Phase, but we're not going to put 4 organs, and we're not going to put Ode to Watermelon. And we're only going to put, we're going to consider putting Dance Patterns because I have a personal bias in favor of that piece. And we're going to try to get it to expand enough to contract that into one thing and fail, so we're going to go the alternate route and do this. Okay, no, this is terrible. I need to stop messing with that. Okay. Center. Thank you. Okay. Yeah, I think that this is good. Sextet I love, but it's just a little bit on the whatever side. And actually, 3 movements. I might just be saying this because they're thinking about this because these 2 pieces have very, very similar endings. Or final movements, I should say. Does 3 movements really belong in S tier? No. No. No, no, it just doesn't. Okay, all right, let's continue. What do we have left? I don't know if this is the right time to mention this, but we have Finishing the Hat. This was a short, 3-minute some piece that he wrote for um, an anniversary celebration of Stephen Sondheim. So it takes this material from this particular song, which is a really nice song, and it adapts it into a piano duet. It's a really nice little piece. I'm gonna put it in A tier. Okay, now we have the quartet for two pianos and two vibraphones, which I talked about pretty extensively. It reminds me a lot of Eight Lines. It features the same chord, which is this like minor seventh chord or minor ninth chord that's built up in two kind of parallel stacks of fifths, right? Like separated by a minor third, and related voicings that you get by moving stuff around with that. Um, you see, it's a cool piece, but I think I just have to put it here in A plus. And you know what? I part of me wants to promote cello counterpoint now, but I'm not going to. Anyway, okay. So next there's Pulse. Pulse is a piece about which I do not have much to say, but I think it is rather sweet. I'm going to put it in A tier. And now, unfortunately, we're going to get into the stuff that I don't really know very much. First of all, we have music for ensemble and orchestra twice. So they need to put a trash can on here. Or I need to put a trash can on here. What's next? Actually, Runner is next. So okay, so there's actually three pieces in here: Runner, music for ensemble and orchestra, and Reich Richter. I just am not super hugely into any of those pieces, and they're all very similar. One kind of bled into the other in some way. Like I think that there was Runner, and then that was like orchestrated for a larger ensemble, and that became music for ensemble and orchestra, while a lot of the material is the same. And then Reich Richter is like based on that. It's like just another piece based on that with a slightly different instrumentation. And like I just wait, hang on a sec. No. Or yes. I think. I'm gonna go check real quick. I just want to make sure I'm remembering which one is which, because I kind of actually maybe don't. I'm gonna go ahead and throw both Runner and Reich Richter into B tier. Or no, music for ensemble and orchestra. Reich Richter, if I'm remembering correctly, actually has some more interesting kind of orchestrational things happening in it from what I remember. But these are the three pieces which I've heard relatively little of, I'm afraid, and so my ability to give them their due consideration might be a little bit lacking. But yeah, I have to say that's probably what I'll do with them. But I just need to double check that Reich Richter is the one that I'm thinking that it is. In all three of these pieces, you see sort of more like atypically varied orchestrational ideas, but I think that most of it is not to great effect. It varies. Some of it really is, but yeah, I couldn't say. Okay, then we have Traveler's Prayer, which I think that'll be S tier for me. That's a really really nice piece. Um, he doesn't write nearly enough for men, right? You know, if you're a as far as the singers go, there's more often pieces that only use women singers or male singers who have incredible high range. Um, so the nice like baritone tenor kind of parts are greatly appreciated for me. And it's just a really sweet piece. It is quite straightforward, um, but it's nice. And then we have Jacob's Letter, which is the most recent piece by Steve Reich, and I've only listened to it 3 or 4 times, but in my opinion, it's not that good. In fact, I think I'm gonna put it in C tier. I hate to say it, but like, it just doesn't convince me. The voice parts are a little dull seeming. Um, there are interesting orchestrational ideas similar to Reich Richter, but and some interesting kind of like novel use of the vibraphone and stuff. But I don't know how to oh I don't know. I'm not sure how to get a lot of intrigue out of listening to it. That might be an exceptionally negative sounding way of expressing that idea, but it just. Mm. So I mean, we have this block of recent pieces filling out the bottom tier, which is kind of interesting. Like I see basically the bias that I expected to see against the earlier stuff and the experimental stuff and the tape stuff, but I think this is my final answer. I think I think it's time to wrap up. Um, what else is there for me to say at this point? I don't know. It was fun. It's fun going through this, and uh, are there any other changes I need to make, just for the sake of having a clean final product here? Um, hmm. Part of me still wants to bump Radio Rewrite up to S because I do like it. In fact, I think I'm gonna do that. It just is it has excellent energy. I also have half a mind to bump up Dance Patterns, but I'm not going to. Dance Patterns, the xylophones in Dance Patterns are very delightful, and that's the same goes for Music for 18. One of my favorite things in Music for 18 is the moments where there's like xylophone doubled with the very top register of the piano. Um, That's just a really, really cool sound. In advanced patterns, he gets a little bit more into the low register of the xylophone, which is also cool. All right, all right. I think this is it. I think this is my final answer. I think it's time to wrap up. Thank you for watching. If you have been, take care.